Nobody's coming for you, sweetheart. Not in here. The voice rumbled like distant thunder, weighted with the kind of practiced superiority that comes from being the biggest presence in every room for a decade straight. It oozed condescension, a thick, deliberate poison meant to suffocate its target. The cramped coastal bar, reeking of ocean salt and yesterday's beer, seemed to contract around the sound itself. The crowd erupted in laughter. Not the kind born of genuine joy, but the nervous, complicit howling of a pack desperate to validate the alpha's dominance. These were young men sculpted from stone and tempered in the brutal furnace of Bud S., their shoulders wide enough to eclipse the bar's amber lights, their necks corded with muscle that spoke of endless punishment and pride. They spotted a solitary woman tucked into a corner booth, her face bathed in the gentle glow of a reading lamp clipped to her book. They registered civilian attire, a reserved presence, and complete indifference to their theatrical entrance. In their universe, a realm of explosive action and unrelenting noise, her silence registered as an aberration, an invitation to disruption. The woman, Anna, never looked up. She didn't flinch. Her finger, slender and unwavering, traced the final line she'd been reading, then turned the page with almost imperceptible deliberation. Her entire universe existed within the ink on paper, the book's weight in her hands, the measured rhythm of her own breathing. This external storm was merely weather, and she remained in the calm, impenetrable eye of her own discipline. She'd faced far louder threats, far greater dangers, and had met them all with this same profound, unsettling stillness. But the old man sitting alone at the bar's far end, the one whose eyes seemed to carry memories of 1,000 dusty horizons, noticed something different. He saw how she held her shoulders, not hunched in fear, but settled like a mountain's foundation. He leaned forward slightly, his drink abandoned. He recognized a posture not learned in any fitness class, but forged under crushing weight and suffocating responsibility. He saw a center of gravity impossibly low, a stillness not passive but coiled. He saw a professional at rest. If you believe that true strength lies not in volume, but in the quiet certainty of action, subscribe to our channel for daily stories that celebrate silent competence over empty noise. The group's leader, a lieutenant with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass and the call sign Brock stitched on his ball cap, leaned closer, planting his massive scarred hands flat on her table, boxing her in. The cloying scent of cheap cologne and expensive whiskey invaded her space. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he drawled, weaponizing every syllable. "This is our spot. We just rolled back from the sandbox, earned ourselves a few drinks, and you're sitting here killing the vibe with your book." He gestured dismissively at the paperback as if it personally offended him. His teammates snickered behind him, a chorus of testosterone-fueled validation. They were a monolith of synchronized arrogance, moving and thinking as a single organism, their individual identities submerged in collective swagger. They registered her plain gray t-shirt, worn jeans, absence of makeup or jewelry, and their assumptions crystallized into one simple, dismissive narrative. She was nobody. A civilian tourist who'd wandered into warrior territory. They couldn't conceive of a reality where her sandbox deployment might have been longer, quieter, and infinitely deadlier than their own. Anna finished her paragraph. She carefully placed a thin leather bookmark between the pages and closed the book with a soft, final sound. In the charged atmosphere, it seemed as loud as a gavel strike. Only then did she lift her eyes. They were pale, clear blue, and utterly devoid of fear, anger, or any reaction Brock had intended to provoke. They were the eyes of a cartographer studying terrain, a surgeon assessing a wound. Analytical. "This is a public establishment," she said, her voice low and even, carrying no more inflection than a line of code. It wasn't a challenge, it was a statement of fact. This utter lack of emotional engagement infuriated Brock more than any shouted retort could have. He thrived on reactions, on causing disruption, on being the gravitational center he created. Her calm was a void that swallowed his bravado whole. "Oh, a real smartass," he sneered, turning to his friends. "She's got a mouth on her." He turned back, his face inches from hers. "You don't get it, do you? We're the guys who make places like this public. We're the reason you can sit here all safe and sound reading your little stories. A little respect would be nice, a little gratitude. The injustice of it hung thick in the air. The other patrons, local fishermen and a few older veterans, looked away, unwilling to be drawn into the seal's orbit. They became intensely interested in their beers, in the peeling paint on the walls, in the silent sports recap playing on the television. They were complicit in their silence, creating an island of humiliation around Anna's table. But Anna wasn't looking for allies. She was cataloging exits, noting reflective surfaces that gave her a view of the entire room, assessing the men before her not as people, but as systems, their posture, balance, weight distribution. It was a deeply ingrained habit, the quiet, constant calculus of survival that had kept her alive in places where respect and gratitude were measured in millimeters and seconds. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the patient, disciplined quiet of a professional on standby, even when the job was simply waiting for the threat to exhaust itself and move on. The universe, however, had different plans. It arrived not with a whisper, but with a horrifying metallic scream. The lazy drone of the bar, jukebox playing forgotten country, low murmur of conversations, shattered with the unmistakable sound of tortured metal and collapsing physics. A piercing shriek of tires on asphalt, too long, too desperate, followed by a percussive, deafening boom that shook the building's foundations. Windows rattled. Half-empty beer glasses danced and chimed. A flash of brilliant orange light painted the street in ghastly momentary glare, followed instantly by the deep concussive thump of a secondary explosion as a fuel tank ignited. Chaos slammed into their reality like a physical entity. For a heartbeat, the bar froze in shocked tableau. Brock and his men, conditioned by years of training for sudden violence, reacted instinctively. They dropped into combat stances, heads swiveling, hands reaching for weapons that weren't there. Their minds screamed IED, ambush. Their training funneled sensory overload into a combat paradigm. "What the hell was that?" one yelled. "Contact front!" another shouted, a ghost of muscle memory from a world away. They were loud, reactive, warriors looking for a fight. But this wasn't a fight, it was a disaster. While they were still processing, still trying to fit the event into a familiar tactical box, Anna moved. There was no hesitation, no moment of shock. A switch flipped inside her, deactivating the reader in the quiet booth and activating something else entirely. She rose from her seat, not in a rush, but in a single fluid, impossibly efficient motion. The book was left behind, a forgotten relic from a lifetime that had existed only 10 seconds ago. Her eyes, calm and analytical before, now scanned, processed, and prioritized at superhuman speed. She was already moving toward the door before the explosion's last echo faded. Her steps measured, deliberate. She wasn't running from danger. She was moving toward the problem. Her movements were a study in pure economy. No wasted energy, no frantic gestures. The physical manifestation of a mind that had already triaged the situation and was executing the first 3 steps of a plan not yet fully formed. The SEALs watched her go, confusion momentarily overriding arrogance. She was supposed to be helpless, the one needing rescue. Yet she was the first through the door, plunging into the unfolding horror without a backward glance. The scene outside was a Bosch painting brought to life. A 3-car pileup had blocked the coastal highway. One car lay upside down, wheels still spinning lazily. Another was accordioned against a telephone pole, its front a mangled ruin of steel and shattered glass. The third, a large pickup truck, was the fire source. Flames greedily consuming its cab, licking at the growing pool of gasoline spreading across asphalt. Black smoke clawed at the night sky. The air was thick with burnt rubber, fuel, and something metallic and terrifyingly human. The sounds formed a symphony of horror. The fire's hiss, twisted metal groaning, distant sirens rising, and worst of all, human sounds. Cries for help, screams of pain, a child's terrified weeping. Into this maelstrom of sensory overload, Anna was an island of absolute calm. While Brock and his team spilled from the bar behind her, shouting at each other, trying to establish a command structure for a situation they didn't understand. "Secure the perimeter! Check for secondary devices!" Anna was already working. She carried a small, unassuming backpack, the kind a hiker might use. but what she pulled from it was neither water bottle nor trail map. Her hands, which had so delicately turned pages, now moved with a surgeon's precision and a mechanic's confidence. First, tactical gloves pulled on with a practiced snap. Then, a compact individual first aid kit. Her eyes had already scanned and dismissed it as a lost cause for immediate intervention. She didn't run to the most dramatic scene, the burning truck. Instead, she moved directly to the overturned sedan. A young woman was half sprawled from the shattered driver's side window, her arm bent unnaturally, blood pulsing from a deep thigh gash. Arterial. Anna was on her knees in the broken glass within seconds. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice firm yet quiet, cutting through the woman's panicked sobs. "I'm going to help you." From her kit, she produced a combat-grade tourniquet. Her hands moved in a blur of practiced efficiency, high and tight on the thigh. She threaded the strap, pulled it taut with a grunt of effort, and twisted the windlass until the bleeding stopped. She noted the time on the small white tab with a marker she produced from her sleeve pocket. 30 seconds. A life saved. Brock, finally realizing this was a mass casualty event and not an enemy attack, tried rallying his men. "Get a fire extinguisher! Somebody call 911 again! We need to get these people out!" His commands were loud but lacked direction. Orders for action, not strategy for salvation. He watched, stunned into uncharacteristic silence, as Anna moved from the first victim to the second, an elderly man in the crushed car, unconscious and bleeding from the head. She didn't run. She moved with purpose that made running seem inefficient. Every action was precise, methodical, utterly professional. She was a silent, gray specter of competence in a world that had suddenly descended into screaming, fiery chaos. The impossible skill, the unblinking focus. It was a direct, irrefutable repudiation of every assumption he made about her minutes before. The woman who couldn't be bothered to acknowledge his presence was now single-handedly imposing order on utter carnage. His sneering disbelief curdled into profound, stomach-churning awe. "No way," he breathed, the words lost in the rising din of sirens. "That's not possible." First responders arrived in a wave of flashing red and blue lights, their sirens dying with a final mournful whoop as they took in the scene. Firefighters in heavy turnout gear began dousing the burning truck with foam, their practice movements a stark contrast to these SEALs' well-intentioned but disorganized efforts. Paramedics fanned out brightly colored bags filled with their trades tools, their faces grim and focused as they began the difficult work of triage. One of them, a burly man with a thick mustache and weary eyes that had seen too much, knelt beside Anna, who was maintaining the airway of the unconscious elderly man. "Okay, ma'am, we'll take it from here," he said, his tone professionally dismissive. "You can step back now." He reached for the patient, but Anna didn't move. "His airway is compromised," she stated without looking up. "Possible C-spine fracture based on mechanism of injury. I'm maintaining manual stabilization. He has decreased level of consciousness. GCS is about a 7. Pupils are unequal." The paramedic paused, hands hovering. The terminology was perfect. The assessment, rapid, concise, accurate. It was the language of a fellow professional, but it came from a woman in a plain t-shirt, her hands covered in someone else's blood. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice losing its condescension and gaining genuine curiosity. Before Anna could answer, a figure emerged from the bar's entrance shadows, the old man from the far corner, the quiet observer. He moved with a stiff gait that spoke of old injuries, but his presence radiated absolute, undeniable authority. He walked past Brock and his men, who instinctively straightened as he passed, sensing a command presence that dwarfed their own. The old man stopped beside the paramedic. "You're going to want to listen to her, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Let her work." The paramedic looked up, annoyed at the interruption from another civilian bystander. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a secured scene. I need you to—" He stopped mid-sentence. He was looking at the old man's face now, really looking. A flicker of recognition, of dawning, horrified respect, crossed his features. The old man wasn't just any old man. He was a local legend. Retired Colonel Jackson, a name whispered with reverence at VFW halls and first responder training centers across the state. A Green Beret who'd forgotten more about battlefield medicine than most doctors would ever learn. The colonel ignored the paramedic's stunned silence. His gaze was fixed on Anna, on the precise, steady way her hand supported the injured man's head, the absolute focus in her eyes. He saw something he recognized intimately, the quiet, unwavering competence of a Tier 1 operator. He turned to the fire chief, who just jogged over for a status report. "Chief," the colonel said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable command weight, "I need you to pull up a file for me right now." The chief, recognizing the colonel instantly, nodded without question. "Yes, sir. Who am I looking for?" The colonel's eyes returned to Anna. "Her name is Major Anna Thorne, GSOC." Then he turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, and let it land on Brock and his assembled SEAL team standing nearby, now utterly silent, their earlier arrogance replaced by palpable confusion and dread. The colonel's voice dropped, becoming clear and resonant, cutting through the emergency scene's noise for all to hear. "You might want to listen to this." The fire chief spoke into his radio, relaying the request. A few moments of static-filled silence passed, an eternity in the flashing emergency lights. Then a voice crackled back over the speaker, tiny and distant, but clear enough for everyone to hear. The reveal began. The voice read from a screen miles away, spitting out facts that were like hammer blows to the foundation of Brock's entire worldview. Subject: Thorne Anna. Major, United States Army. Unit: Classified. Primary specialty: 18. Delta, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. Secondary specialty: Classified. A pause. The chief looked at the colonel, eyebrows raised. The colonel simply nodded, his expression unreadable. The voice continued, each piece of information adding another layer of impossibility. Combat deployments, 12. Locations, classified. Combat hours, over 4,000. Medals, Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with V for Valor, 4 Purple Hearts. The list went on, a staccato recitation of heroism and sacrifice, staggering in its scope. Additional qualifications: graduate of Ranger School, Halo Jumpmaster, instructor status in Advanced Tactical Casualty Care, currently assigned as lead medical planner for JSOC. There was a final pregnant pause before the dispatcher's voice returned, now filled with awe. "Sir, her mission classifications are all Tier 1. The phrase hung in the air. Tier 1, the very pinnacle of the special operations world. The quiet professionals who operated in the deepest shadows, whose very existence was a closely guarded secret. A level of prestige and lethality that made a regular SEAL team, as elite as they were, seem like a local police force. The paramedics stared at Anna, who hadn't moved or acknowledged the recitation of her own legend. She remained focused entirely on her patient. He looked at her steady hands, her calm face, and finally understood. He wasn't looking at a civilian. He was looking at one of the most experienced and decorated combat medics on the entire planet. The colonel stepped forward into the space between the SEALs and the scene. He looked directly at Brock, his eyes like chips of ice. Then he turned his back on them, faced Anna, and executed a perfect formal salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice ringing with respect so profound it was almost a physical force, "you have the scene." The story of that night at the Sandpiper Bar spread through the special operations community like a shockwave. It wasn't transmitted through official channels or after-action reports, but through the faster, more potent grapevine of military gossip. It was told in hushed tones in chow halls at Fort Bragg, whispered between operators in the back of C-130s over undisclosed airspace, and typed out on encrypted forums where quiet professionals gathered to exchange news. The tale was embellished with each telling, as all good legends are, but the core elements remained immutable. The arrogant SEALs, the quiet woman with a book, the fiery crash, and the stunning, humbling reveal. The narrative became a modern fable, a cautionary tale about the mortal sin of assumption. It was a story about how competence doesn't always wear a uniform or announce its presence with a roar. Sometimes it sits quietly in a corner, waiting to be needed. They weren't formally punished. For these SEALs involved, the aftermath was a crucible of shame. Their actions had occurred off-duty and didn't break any specific military law. But the informal punishment, the judgment of their peers, was far more severe. They became the Sandpiper Crew, a moniker that would follow them for the rest of their careers. They faced a wall of silent disapproval from other operators, coldness in their superiors' eyes, and endless cutting jokes from other teams. They'd violated an unspoken code. They disrespected a fellow warrior. And worse, they'd done so out of pure, unadulterated ignorance. Their hard-won reputations were tarnished not by failure in combat, but by failure of character. Brock was hit hardest. His entire identity was built on the foundation of being an elite warrior, a Navy SEAL. That foundation had been pulverized. He replayed the scene in his mind 1,000 times. His sneering insults, her unnerving calm, the revelation of her identity. The irony was almost too much to bear. He who prided himself on his ability to assess threats and read situations had failed the most basic of tests. He'd looked at a lioness and seen a lamb. He did something that took more courage than any firefight he'd ever been in. He sought out Colonel Jackson. He found him at the VFW hall nursing a coffee and stood before him stripped of all his former swagger. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain his behavior. He simply said, "Sir, I was wrong. I was arrogant and I was ignorant. I need to understand." The colonel looked at him for a long time, his gaze dissecting and measuring the young lieutenant. He saw genuine remorse in his eyes, the painful honesty of a man confronting his own failings. "The first step to wisdom, son," the colonel finally said, "is admitting you know nothing." He spent the next hour talking to Brock, not about Anna Thorne's classified missions, but about the philosophy of the quiet professional. He spoke of a different kind of strength, one rooted in humility, discipline, and constant pursuit of knowledge. He explained that true respect isn't demanded by the insignia on your chest, but commanded by the competence in your hands and the integrity in your heart. Brock's transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound. He began to listen more than he spoke. He started reading history, philosophy, strategy, devouring books with the same intensity he'd once reserved for physical training. He stopped measuring himself and his men by the noise they made and started measuring them by the results they achieved. His team noticed the change. The boisterous bragging was replaced by quiet confidence. The reckless energy was channeled into meticulous planning. He started teaching his men to look deeper, to see beyond the surface, to never again make the mistake of underestimating someone based on their appearance, gender, or branch of service. He instituted a new rule for his platoon. Before any off-base activity, they would have a sandpiper brief, where he would personally recount the story of his own humiliation as a lesson in humility. The legend of the incident began to take on a more formal institutional life. A photograph of the crash scene taken by a local news crew was anonymously pinned to the main bulletin board at the Naval Special Warfare Center. In the photo, amidst the wreckage and flashing lights, a lone, calm figure could be seen kneeling over an injured person. There was no name, no caption, but everyone knew who it was and what it represented. The location of the crash on the highway became an unofficial landmark. New operators driving past it for the first time would have the spot pointed out to them. "That's Thorne's Corner," the senior men would say. "That's where a major taught a SEAL team that caliber is more important than volume." The story became a teaching tool, a powerful anecdote used by instructors to hammer home the importance of situational awareness and the dangers of hubris. It served as a constant reminder that in the world of special operations, the most dangerous person in a room is often the one you notice least. Anna, for her part, remained completely detached from the legend she created. She never spoke of the incident. When the elderly man she'd saved sent a heartfelt letter of thanks to her command, it was quietly added to her already thick personnel file. When a formal letter of commendation from the local fire department arrived, she filed it away without comment. Her focus was already on the next mission, the next problem to solve, the next life to save. Praise and recognition were as irrelevant to her as Brock's insults had been. The only thing that mattered was the work itself. Her legacy wasn't in the stories being told about her, but in the quiet, competent execution of her duty. She was a professional, and the job was all that ever mattered. A year later, Brock stood before a new group of freshly minted SEALs, their faces young, eager, and full of the same untempered arrogance he once possessed. They were in a classroom preparing for their first overseas deployment. This was his sandpiper brief. He stood not behind a podium, but in the center of the room, meeting each of their eyes. He told the story without varnish, painting a brutal, honest picture of his own ignorance. He described his taunts, his condescension, and the soul-crushing moment of the reveal. "I thought I was the tip of the spear," he told them, his voice raw with the memory of his own folly. "I looked at Major Thorne and I saw a civilian, a woman, a soft target. I saw everything but what she actually was, a more experienced, more disciplined, and on that night a more effective operator than my entire team combined. My assumptions nearly got people killed. Her competence saved them." He let the words hang in the air. When you go out there, you will encounter people who don't look like you, who don't talk like you, who weren't forged in the same fires as you. Your job is not to judge them. Your job is to assess them based on one metric and one metric only: their competence. Respect is a currency you earn, not a tax you levy. Remember that. Remember Thorne's corner. The room was silent. The young SEALs were no longer looking at him as just their platoon commander. They were looking at a man who had the courage to turn his greatest failure into his most powerful lesson. The legacy of Anna's actions wasn't a plaque on a wall, but a fundamental shift in the mindset of the men who would follow. It was a living, breathing thing, passed down from one generation of warriors to the next. The story had become institutional folklore, a critical piece of the informal curriculum that truly shapes a unit's culture. It was a constant, powerful reminder that the true measure of a warrior is not the patch on their shoulder, but the quiet professionalism in their soul. It taught them that strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the calmest hands in the chaos. The ripples of that night continued to spread, creating a legacy both profound and largely invisible, just like the woman at its center. The paramedic who'd been on scene, humbled and inspired by the encounter, redesigned his department's entire mass casualty training protocol, basing it on the principles of efficiency and calm he'd witnessed firsthand from Major Thorne. He called it the Thorne Protocol, a quiet tribute to the woman who taught him in a few short minutes a lesson he hadn't learned in 20 years on the job. The elderly man whose life she'd saved made a full recovery. He volunteered at the local VA hospital, and whenever he encountered a young, arrogant soldier, he would gently tell them a story about an angel in a gray t-shirt who moved through fire and broken glass to save his life. A woman who possessed a quiet strength greater than any army. He never knew her name, but he never forgot her actions. And Anna Thorne continued her work in the shadows, a ghost in the global machine of conflict. She moved through dusty villages and forgotten countries, treating wounds, training local medics, and solving problems that the world would never know existed. Her name would never be in the newspapers. Her face would never be on television. Her reward was simply the knowledge that she'd made a difference, that a life was saved, that a mission was successful. Her silence was her sanctuary, her competence, her shield. True legacy, the story of Anna Thorne teaches us, is not a monument you build to yourself. It's not found in the stories told around a campfire or the medals pinned to a chest. It's not what you leave behind, but what continues forward because of you. It's the lesson a humbled lieutenant teaches his new recruits. It's the improved technique a paramedic uses to save a stranger. It's the quiet inspiration that drives a good man to serve others. It's the silent, spreading wave of competence, humility, and respect that one person can set in motion. A wave that continues to wash over the shores of the world long after they have gone. It proves that the loudest noise in the universe is not an explosion or a shout, but the deafening silence of a job done right. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where professional discipline defines true worth, subscribe to The Final Watch for daily story updates.